The boy could not have been more than 14, and he came off his lathered horse in a heap rather than a dismount, tumbling into the dust of Canyon Ford's Main Street with a crossbow bolt buried deep in his shoulder and blood soaking his shirt black in the July heat. Marshall Lockhart was across the street in a heartbeat, his ledger book falling from his hands into the mud left by the morning's brief cloudburst. He had spent 11 years buying and selling cattle across the territory, and he had learned to read a wound the way other men read a bill of sale. This one was bad. Not killing bad, not yet, but bad enough that the boy's lips had gone the color of ash. "Ma'am." The boy's voice cracked as Marshall knelt beside him, and his wild eyes found the only other person close, a woman stepping down from the boardwalk in front of the mercantile with a rifle already in her hands, as if she carried it the way other women carried a parasol. "Ma'am, they're coming. The supply train. It ain't lost. It was took. Combined men took it up the Solomon Fork 3 days back, and they mean to starve the ford out so folks sell their water rights cheap, and there's more of them coming right now, right behind me. They mean to." He never finished. His eyes rolled white and he went slack in Marshall's arms. "They mean to what?" The woman had dropped to her knees on the boy's other side, her rifle laid across her lap so both her hands were free to press against the wound. She looked up and Marshall saw for the first time the face that would end up meaning more to him than any ledger, any herd, any sum of money he had ever tallied. She had dark hair escaping its pins in the humid air, eyes the gray-green of sage after rain, and hands that did not shake even though her voice, when she spoke again, carried an edge of real fear. "Mister, whoever you are, help me get pressure on this or he's going to bleed out right here in the street." "Marshall Lockhart," he said, already stripping off his coat to wad against the wound. "Cattle buyer out of Ellsworth. Sadie Donnelly. I own the Circle D west of the canyon." She pressed harder and the boy groaned, which they both took as a good sign. "You believe what he said? About the train being took on purpose? I believe a boy doesn't ride a horse to death and take a crossbow bolt for a story he made up." Marshall looked up the street, past the mercantile, past the bank with its new brick front, toward the canyon rim where the road came down off the high plains. Dust was rising out there, more than a single rider would make. "And I believe whoever did that to him is not far behind, and they're not going to want him telling anybody else." Sadie followed his gaze and her jaw set in a way that Marshall would come to know well over the following days, a set to her mouth that meant she had already decided what she was going to do and was only working out the fastest way to do it. "Get him inside," she said. "Doc Hale is 2 doors down. I'll get the sheriff. Sheriff Purdy took sick a week ago, ma'am. His deputy is out at the Wagner spread settling a fence dispute and won't be back until dark." Marshall was already lifting the boy, careful of the bolt still jutting from his shoulder, careful not to jar it loose and start the bleeding fresh. "That leaves us." "It does," Sadie said, and there was no complaint in it, only calculation, the way a woman looks at a fence line and decides how many posts she will need before sundown. They got the boy to Dr. Hale's office above the feed store, and the old doctor, gray-bearded and unhurried in a way that belied quick and capable hands, went to work with a calm that steadied even Marshall's racing pulse. Sadie stood at the window the whole while, rifle back in her hands, watching the road. "Riders," she said, after a few minutes that felt much longer, "4 of them, coming down off the canyon road at a hard trot." Marshall came to stand beside her. Below, the town of Canyon Ford spread out along the single street that ran parallel to the river gorge, a settlement of perhaps 300 souls that existed entirely because of 2 things: the bridge that spanned the canyon a half-mile upstream, and the ferry that crossed the river below the falls when the bridge traffic backed up during roundup season. Every bit of cattle, every wagon of goods, every letter and every dream that needed to leave the high plains for the railhead at Ellsworth had to cross one or the other. Whoever controlled the bridge and the ferry controlled the only door out of 100 square miles of good grazing land. Marshall knew, because it was his business to know such things, that the Bar K Combine had been buying up water rights along the canyon rim for 2 years, quietly, through men who did not put the Bar K's name on any paper. He knew because he was the one man in the territory whose ledgers could not be bought, and it had made him exactly as popular with certain ranchers as a rattlesnake at a church picnic. "Those 4 ride for the Combine," Sadie said quietly. "I know that piebald gelding. It belongs to a man named Coy Rassler. He does dirty work for Otis Kane." "The same Otis Kane who's been trying to buy the Circle D out from under you for a year." She glanced at him, surprised he knew that. "You've heard of my troubles. I buy cattle from half the outfits between here and the Solomon River, Miss Donnelly. I hear about troubles the way a barber hears about business he's not asked to comment on." Marshall watched the 4 riders slow as they entered the town's outskirts, watched them fan out the way men do when they are hunting rather than traveling. "They're looking for the boy. They won't find him in a doctor's office in the middle of town without half of Canyon Ford noticing," Sadie said. "But they'll ask questions and someone will point this way eventually, whether out of fear or foolishness." Dr. Hale looked up from his work, sweat beading on his forehead despite the coolness of the upstairs room. "This bolts in deep. I can get it out, but he's going to need rest and quiet and no excitement of the kind that seems to be riding down your street right now." "How long before he can talk?" Marshall asked. "An hour if he's lucky, a day if he's not." Sadie was already moving toward the door. "I'll go down and see what they want." "Better they find a woman minding her own business than have them come up here and find you crouched over a wounded boy with a rifle in your lap, Doctor." "Sadie." Marshall caught her arm before he had quite decided to do it, and she looked down at his hand and then up at his face with an expression that told him plainly she was not a woman accustomed to being caught by anything, least of all a stranger's hand. He let go at once. "I apologize. But you don't know these men, and I don't either. Not personally. And 4 riders looking for a boy who just told us they've stolen an entire supply train is not a conversation to have alone. I've been handling men who want to take what's mine since I was 19 years old and buried my father, Mr. Lockhart," Sadie said, though not unkindly. "But I take your point. Come along, then, if you're of a mind to be useful. Just let me do the talking. You have the look of a man who says exactly what he thinks, and that is not always the wisest thing in this particular conversation." They went down together, out onto the boardwalk in front of the feed store, into the thick July air that smelled of dust and coming rain, the kind of heavy stillness that meant a storm was building somewhere behind the canyon walls, even though the sun still hammered down without mercy. The 4 riders had stopped in front of the saloon, and the one on the piebald gelding, a broad-shouldered man with a drooping mustache and eyes like a man perpetually calculating a debt owed him, was leaning down to speak to old Henry Popplewell, who ran the livery. "Miss Donnelly." The mustached man touched his hat brim as Sadie and Marshall approached, though the gesture held no real courtesy in it. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." "I might say the same, Mr. Rassler. The Circle D doesn't sit on your usual road." Sadie's voice was pleasant in the way of a woman passing the time of day, though Marshall could hear the wire underneath it. "What brings you and your friends down from the high country?" "Looking for a runaway. Boy who works the Kane spread, took a horse and some supplies that weren't his and lit out. Mr. Kane would appreciate it if anyone who's seen him would speak up." "A runaway," Marshall said before he could stop himself, and felt Sadie's foot press lightly, deliberately, against his boot. He understood the message and let his voice go easy, disinterested. "Haven't seen any boy come through, but then I only rode in myself an hour past. Marshall Lockhart, cattle buyer." Rassler's eyes flicked over him with the particular contempt some men reserved for anyone who worked with numbers instead of a rope. "The Lockhart that's been poking around the shipping manifests down at Ellsworth." "The same. Heard you were an honest man. Heard that's caused you some trouble." "I find honesty causes trouble mostly for men who'd rather it didn't exist," Marshall said, and this time Sadie did not press his foot because there was nothing in the words she could quarrel with, even if she might have wished them a touch more diplomatic. Rassler's mustache twitched, not quite a smile. "Well, if either of you see that boy, Mr. Kane's offering a fair reward. He's worried about him, out alone in this heat with storms coming. Awful worried to send 4 armed men after one runaway stable boy," Sadie observed. "Mr. Kane takes care of what's his," Rassler said, and there was something in the flatness of the statement that made the hair rise on the back of Marshall's neck, an implication that ran far beyond stable boys and horses. Rassler touched his hat again, wheeled his gelding, and the 4 of them rode on down the street, stopping here and there to repeat their question, working their way toward the far end of town. "They'll circle back," Sadie said quietly, watching them go. "They didn't believe either of us, not entirely. Rassler's not a stupid man, whatever else he is. Then, we don't have much time." Marshall looked back up toward the doctor's window. "That boy needs to tell someone official what he knows, and we need to get word to whoever's expecting that supply train before the whole valley runs short of flour and coffee and gunpowder in the middle of thunderstorm season." "Official." Sadie's laugh held no humor in it. "Sheriff Purdy's laid up with a fever. His deputy's out mending fences 15 miles away, and the nearest federal marshal is a 2-day ride to Ellsworth even if the roads hold, which they won't. Not once these storms really open up. There isn't going to be anybody official here in time to matter, Mr. Lockhart. There's just whoever's standing in this street willing to do something about it." Marshall looked at her for a long moment. This woman with sage-colored eyes and a rifle she clearly knew how to use, standing in the dusty street of a town that lived or died by a bridge and a ferry that a combine of powerful ranchers wanted for themselves. He thought of his ledgers, his careful, honest numbers that had already cost him friendships and nearly cost him his life once outside a saloon in Ellsworth, when a man named Gantry had not appreciated having his cattle count fraud exposed in front of witnesses. "Then I suppose that's us," he said. "I suppose it is." Sadie studied him back, an appraisal as thorough as any she might give a horse she was thinking of buying. "Do you shoot as straight as you keep books, Mr. Lockhart?" "Straighter, ma'am. Numbers I have to think about. A gun I mostly don't." Something almost like the beginning of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Good. You're going to need to be straight with both before this business is finished." They went back up to the doctor's office to wait and to plan, while outside the sky over the canyon rim continued to darken, and thunder rolled distant and low, like something enormous turning over in its sleep. The boy's name, when he finally woke enough to speak clearly, was Tobias Reyes, and he had worked the cane spread stable since he was 11 years old, an orphan taken in more out of need for cheap labor than charity, though he did not put it that way himself. Dr. Hale had gotten the bolt out clean, and though Tobias was weak and gray-faced, his mind was sharp enough once he understood he was safe. "The supply train left Ellsworth 6 days back," he said, propped up on the doctor's narrow bed with Sadie on one side and Marshall on the other, and the doctor himself standing watch at the window for any sign of Rassler's men returning. "Flour, coffee, gunpowder, medicine, seed for next spring, all of it meant for Canyon Ford and the ranches around it. I heard Mr. Kane talking to Rassler 2 nights before, in the barn where he thought nobody could hear on account of I was up in the loft mending tack. He said if the town runs short enough, long enough, right in the middle of the worst of the storm season when nobody can get up to Ellsworth easy anyhow, folks will start selling. Water rights, grazing leases, even land outright, just to have cash enough to buy what they need from wherever he decides to sell it to them at whatever price he decides to charge. He means to starve out half the valley to buy it cheap," Sadie said, her voice tight with a fury she was working hard to keep controlled for the boy's sake. "Yes, ma'am. And he had the driver of that supply train paid off already, some fellow named Cutter, so it wasn't even stole, not really, it was just diverted. Took up a side canyon road that don't go nowhere but an old mining claim Mr. Kane owns near Deadman's Bend, and left there, wagons and all, under guard, waiting for him to decide when folks are hurting enough to make it worth bringing back out. "How many men guarding it?" Marshall asked. "I only heard Rassler say 6, maybe 8. "You decided to ride and warn the town yourself," Sadie said gently, "instead of keeping quiet and keeping safe." Tobias's young face flushed. "Mr. Kane's never been kind to me, ma'am, but there's women and children in this valley who didn't do nothing to deserve going hungry so he can steal their land cheaper. My own mother, before she passed, she used to say a person's got to answer for what they know, whether or not it's convenient. I couldn't just let it happen and say nothing." Marshall felt something tighten in his chest, an old ache he recognized as the particular pain of watching courage in someone very young who had no earthly reason to have learned it so well. He thought of his own ledgers again, the honest numbers that had cost him so much, and understood suddenly and completely why he kept writing them anyway. "You did right," he told the boy. "And now it's our turn to answer for what we know." Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to strike the window glass, and far off toward the canyon, lightning flickered silent and white against a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise. They moved Tobias that night, once the doctor judged him strong enough for a slow wagon ride, out to the Circle D rather than leaving him in town where Rassler's men might think to search more thoroughly. Sadie's ranch sat in a wide bend of the valley 2 miles from Canyon Ford, close enough to reach quickly and far enough to feel, for the moment, like a fortress rather than a target. It was a good spread Marshall saw as they came up the lane in the rain-lashed dark, well-fenced, the barn sturdy and recently re-roofed, the house itself modest but sound, lamplight glowing warm in the windows through the downpour. "You run this place alone?" Marshall asked, helping her down from the wagon seat while 2 of her hands, a weathered older man named Silas and a younger one called Pete, hurried out with a lantern to help carry Tobias inside. "I have 4 hands and a foreman who's been with the family since before I was born," Sadie said, an edge of defensiveness in her voice that told him she had answered some version of this question many times before, usually from men who meant it as an insult rather than genuine curiosity. "But yes, since my father died 4 years ago, the decisions have been mine. The Circle D runs better now than it did in his last years, if you want the honest truth, Mr. Lockhart. I know every acre of this land and every head of cattle on it, and I don't need a husband to tell me how to manage what I already manage well." "I didn't suggest you did," Marshall said mildly, and something in his tone, free of the mockery she had clearly braced for, made her glance at him again in the lantern light, reassessing. "No," she admitted, "you didn't." Inside, they settled Tobias into a spare bedroom, and Sadie's foreman, a barrel-chested man named Amos Cray with a face like weathered saddle leather, listened to the boy's story with a grim expression that deepened with every detail. "Deadman's Bend," Amos said, once Tobias had finished and been left to rest under the watchful eye of the housekeeper, a stout widow named Mrs. Prout who mothered everyone within reach whether they wanted it or not. "That's a hard 2 days' ride up the old mining road, through country that floods bad even in a light rain, and this storm season's shaping up to be anything but light. If that road's out, or the canyon crossing at Willow Creek is running high, we could lose more than time getting up there." "We don't have a choice about the time," Sadie said. "Every day that train sits hidden is another day this valley goes hungrier and more desperate, and desperate people sell cheap, Amos. You know that as well as I do." "I know it. I'm only saying it won't be an easy ride, and there's still Rassler's men to think about between here and there." Marshall had been quiet through most of this, standing near the fireplace with a cup of Mrs. Prout's strong coffee warming his hands, but now he spoke. "I'll ride. I know the country up past Deadman's Bend from buying cattle off the Hutchins spread 2 summers back, and I know Otis Kane's operation well enough from his shipping manifests to guess how he's likely thinking. More than that, I've got the standing to make this stick once we bring it back to light. My word carries weight with the cattle buyers and bankers in Ellsworth precisely because I've spent 11 years being too honest to bribe. If I ride into Ellsworth with proof of what Kane's done, backed by sworn statements. It won't just embarrass him. It'll ruin him. And it'll do it in a way no local sheriff or federal marshal riding through once a season ever could. You'll need someone who knows this valley better than the manifests taught you, Sadie said. Someone who can read the weather in these canyons and knows which fords are safe to cross when a storm's building, and someone who knows the back trails that avoid Kane's usual patrol routes. Marshall met her eyes across the firelit room. Are you offering, Miss Donnelly? I'm not offering, Mr. Lockhart. I'm informing you that I'm coming, because it is my valley too, and because a woman who runs her own ranch does not sit at home waiting for a man she met 8 hours ago to solve her problems for her. She said it evenly, without heat, but there was steel underneath every word. Amos will need to stay and manage the Circle D and keep an eye on Tobias, and watch for Rassler's men in case they come sniffing around out here. But I am riding to Deadman's Bend, and you may either accept my help or attempt to leave without me, in which case I promise you I will simply follow a half-mile behind and arrive at exactly the same time, only wetter and more annoyed. Marshall found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he was smiling. I would not dream of leaving without you, Miss Donnelly. It would be a poor use of the daylight arguing about it. Good, Sadie said, and there it was again, that almost smile. Then we leave at first light, storm or no storm, because Otis Kane is not going to wait politely while we discuss it further. The storm broke in earnest just before dawn, thunder rolling continuous through the canyon walls like some great animal pacing. And by the time Marshall and Sadie rode out from the Circle D with saddlebags packed with hardtack and coffee, and enough rope and tools to manage a river crossing if it came to that, the rain had settled into the steady, relentless kind that promised to last the better part of the day. They rode mostly in silence for the first hour, following the old mining road as it climbed away from the valley floor into rougher, more broken country, red rock canyons cutting deep on either side, the road itself already turning to a slick red mud that made the horses pick their way with careful, deliberate steps. Marshall found himself watching Sadie's hands on the reins, competent and sure even as lightning cracked close enough to make her horse dance sideways, and thought that he had never in his life met a woman quite like her, nor, if he was honest with himself, a man either. You're staring, Mr. Lockhart, Sadie said, not looking at him, though he could hear the amusement underneath the rain. I'm admiring your horsemanship, Miss Donnelly. A man can admire a skill without it being improper. I've heard that excuse before, usually from men admiring considerably less useful things. I promise you my intentions were purely professional. Were they? She glanced at him then, quick and sharp, and something passed between them in that look, an acknowledgment neither of them was quite ready to name, before she turned her attention back to the treacherous road ahead. We should reach Willow Creek by midday if the road holds. That's usually the first real obstacle. It floods fast in weather like this, sometimes rising 4 feet within an hour of a hard rain starting up in the high country. And if it's already too high to cross, then we find another way or we wait, and waiting is the one thing we can least afford. She was quiet a moment, guiding her horse around a fallen branch. Can I ask you something, Mr. Lockhart? Marshall, he said. If we're going to ride 2 days together through flooding country to expose a powerful man's crimes, I think we might dispense with the surnames. Marshall, then. She tested the name in her mouth as though weighing it, and he found he liked the sound of it there more than he had any right to. Why do it? The honest ledgers, I mean. You must know by now what it costs you. Friendships, business. I'd wager more than one man has threatened worse than words over what you've written down in plain black ink. Marshall was quiet for a moment, watching the rain sheet across the canyon ahead of them. My father was a cattle buyer too, back in Missouri before we came west. He kept 2 sets of books, one for the ranchers and one for himself, skimmed a little off every deal, never enough that anyone caught on quick, but enough that by the time he died, he cheated near every man who ever trusted him. When I took up the trade myself, I swore I'd never be a man whose word needed checking against a second ledger nobody was supposed to see. He shrugged, a little self-conscious under her attention. It's cost me, but I sleep well, Sadie, and I've come to think that's worth more than most of what it's cost. Sadie was quiet for a long moment, the rain drumming steady around them. My father was the opposite sort of man. Honest to a fault, generous to a fault, the kind of rancher who'd loan his last dollar to a neighbor in trouble even when it meant his own family went without. When he died, the Circle D was deep in debt, more from kindness than mismanagement, and everyone in the valley, including men like Otis Kane, expected me to fold within the year, sell out, marry some rancher's son and let him run what was left of the place into somebody else's pocket. Her chin lifted, rain running down her face like she hadn't noticed it was there. I did not fold. It took 3 years of work that would have broken most men, but the Circle D is solvent now, and it is mine, and I mean to keep it that way. I believe you, Marshall said simply, and meant it, and saw something in her face ease slightly at being believed without qualification, as though it was a rarer gift than he had realized. They rode on through the storm, and if the conversation had opened something between them, neither remarked on it further, though Marshall noticed that afterward they rode a little closer together on the narrow trail than the width of the road strictly required. Willow Creek, when they reached it near midday, was running high and brown and fast, well above its normal banks, carrying branches, and once what looked like an entire uprooted sapling passed them in the swirling current. "We can't cross that," Marshall said, studying the water with a sinking feeling. "Not without real risk to the horses. There's a footbridge a half-mile upstream, an old miner's crossing, narrow but sound last I knew of it. We'll have to lead the horses across single file and hope the storm hasn't taken it out yet." Sadie was already turning her horse upstream. "Come on, we're losing daylight." The footbridge, when they found it, was a rickety affair of rope and split logs strung between 2 rock outcrops above the roaring creek, swaying visibly in the wind and rain. But it held, and they made the crossing one horse at a time, Marshall going first with his own gelding, and then coming back to help steady Sadie's mare, whose nerves were clearly fraying under the noise and motion of the storm. "Easy," Marshall murmured, one hand on the mare's bridle, the other steadying Sadie's arm as she led the animal across the swaying boards, the creek boiling white and furious below them. "Easy now, we're almost across." Halfway over, a gust of wind caught the bridge hard enough to make the whole structure lurch, and Sadie's boot slipped on the wet wood. Marshall's arm was around her waist before he had quite decided to move, hauling her back against his chest as her mare shied and nearly bolted forward off the narrow crossing. For a moment they simply stood there, Sadie's back pressed against him, both their hearts hammering, the storm raging around them, and Marshall was intensely, uncomfortably aware of how well she fit against him, how the scent of rain and horse and something uniquely her own filled the small space between them. "Thank you," Sadie said, a little breathless, once the mare had settled and they had both regained their footing. "Don't thank me yet," Marshall said, his voice rougher than he intended. "We're only halfway across." They made the far bank without further incident, though Marshall noted that his arm remained looped protectively near her waist until they were both solidly on dry ground, and that neither of them commented on it, and that the silence between them afterward felt entirely different from the silence before, charged with something neither was yet willing to speak aloud. They camped that night in a shallow cave above the flood line, a dry hollow in the canyon wall that Sadie knew from years of riding this country, and shared hardtack and coffee boiled over a small fire while the storm continued its assault outside, lightning strobing the canyon in brief, blinding flashes. "Tell me about your family," Sadie said, wrapped in her blanket near the fire, her hair drying in loose waves that Marshall found himself watching more than was strictly wise. "Beyond your father and his ledgers." "Not much to tell. My mother died when I was young. I've a sister back in Missouri, married to a school teacher, 3 children I've never met because the cattle trade doesn't leave much room for visiting. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. I suppose I've built a life that's mostly numbers and cattle and hotel rooms, Sadie. It hadn't troubled me much until recently. Until recently, Sadie repeated softly and did not ask him to clarify, though the look she gave him across the small fire suggested she understood exactly what he meant and felt something similar herself. "What about you?" Marshall asked. "Besides the ranch? Is there no one waiting for you back at the Circle D, wondering why you've ridden off into a flood with a strange cattle buyer?" Sadie's laugh was soft, a little rueful. "There was a man 2 years back. Wanted to marry me, wanted the Circle D folded into his own spread, wanted, I came to understand, a wife who'd manage his household and stay well clear of managing his cattle. I told him no, and he told half the valley I was too proud and too stubborn to ever make a good wife to anyone." Her eyes met Marshall's across the fire, steady and unflinching. "I have wondered sometimes if he was right, if I've made myself too hard a woman for any man to want." "He was a fool," Marshall said, with more heat than he intended. "And not because he was wrong that you're stubborn, because you are, Sadie, formidably so. He was a fool because he thought your strength was something to be managed rather than something to be treasured. Any man worth having wouldn't want to fold you into anything. He'd want to stand beside you." Sadie was quiet for a long moment, the firelight flickering across her face, and when she spoke again her voice was softer than he had yet heard it. "That is a very fine thing to say, Marshall Lockhart. It happens to be true," he said, "which I find is usually the finest kind of thing to say." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, though both, Marshall suspected, thought about it long after the fire had burned low and they had settled into their separate blankets, listening to the storm rage on outside their small dry shelter and to the quiet, steady sound of each other's breathing. They reached the mining road above Deadman's Bend by the following afternoon, the storm having eased somewhat into a persistent drizzle that still turned every low spot in the trail to treacherous mud. Marshall's information from the shipping manifests, cross-checked against Tobias's account, had given them a rough idea of where Kane's men might be holding the diverted supply train, and Sadie's knowledge of the old mining claims in the area helped narrow it further. "There," Sadie said quietly, reining in her horse at the top of a rise and pointing down into a narrow side canyon where, half hidden under canvas tarps and brush, 6 covered wagons sat in a rough line near the boarded-up entrance of an old silver mine. 2 men were visible near a small fire, rifles close at hand, and the shapes of at least 4 more could be seen moving among the wagons. "8 men," Marshall murmured, counting carefully. "Matches what Tobias heard." "We can't take 8 men in a direct fight," Sadie said. "Not the 2 of us." "No, but we don't need to fight them. We need proof, and we need to get that proof to Ellsworth before Kane can cover his tracks or, worse, before this rain turns into the kind of flash flood that could take that whole canyon and everyone in it, wagons included." Sadie studied the sky, which had grown steadily darker even through the afternoon, the particular greenish cast that experienced ranchers learned to fear more than any ordinary storm cloud. "That old mine," she said slowly. "If Kane's using it to store anything, or if any of his men are sheltering inside it from the rain, we may have a bigger problem than proof and paperwork. These old silver claims flood fast in weather like this, and the timber supports in workings that haven't been maintained in years. If that canyon gets the kind of water Willow Creek is carrying right now, that mine could flood and collapse with anyone inside it." As if summoned by her words, thunder cracked directly overhead, closer than anything they had yet heard, and the drizzle sharpened abruptly into a hard, driving rain. "We need to get closer," Marshall said, quietly. "See what we're truly dealing with before that storm breaks worse." They left the horses tethered in a stand of cottonwoods a quarter-mile back and made their way forward on foot, keeping to the cover of rocks and brush along the canyon rim, until they had a clear view down into the camp below. Marshall counted the wagons again, confirmed the markings on several crates visible beneath torn canvas, flour and gunpowder stamped clear enough to read even from this distance, and began, quietly, sketching notes into a small waterproof notebook he carried for exactly this purpose. It was Sadie who first noticed the third thing, the detail that changed everything. "Marshall," she whispered, gripping his arm, "look there by the mine entrance." He followed her gaze and saw them. A woman, perhaps 30, herding two small children, a boy of about 6 and a girl younger still, toward the boarded mine entrance, one of Kane's guards gesturing them forward with obvious impatience rather than kindness. "Who in God's name is that?" Marshall breathed. "I don't know," Sadie said, her face gone pale with something between confusion and dawning horror. "But those aren't Kane's men's families, not dressed like that, not looking that frightened. Marshall, I think those are hostages." They watched, hearts hammering, as the woman and children disappeared into the dark mouth of the old mine, followed by two of the armed guards, presumably to keep watch, while the rain intensified around them into a genuine downpour, thunder crashing almost continuously now, and the first distant rumble of something that was not thunder at all, but the sound of water beginning to move in volume through the narrow canyon upstream. "We don't have time to figure out who they are before we act," Marshall said, his voice low and urgent. "That canyon's going to flood, Sadie, and soon, and if that mine floods with people inside it, I know." Sadie's jaw was set, her earlier calculation returning, sharper now with real fear driving it. "We have to get them out, both of us, now before we worry about wagons or proof or anything else. 2 of us against 8 armed men in a flash flood. Do you have a better idea, Marshall Lockhart?" She was already checking her rifle, her hands steady despite everything. "Because I am not standing on this ridge writing figures in a notebook while a woman and 2 children drown in a mine shaft." Marshall looked at her for one long moment, rain streaming down both their faces, and felt something settle in his chest, a certainty as complete as any he had ever known. "No," he said, "neither am I. But we do this smart, not just brave. We circle around, come at the camp from 2 directions, make it look like there's more of us than there are. Draw the guards away from the mine entrance if we can, toward the wagons, make them think that's the target. Then one of us gets into the mine while the other keeps them occupied." "I'll go for the mine," Sadie said immediately. "I know the layout of old workings like this better than you do, grew up around abandoned claims all through this country. You're the better shot at range, and you'll do more good keeping their attention on the wagons." Marshall wanted badly to argue, to insist he be the one to go into danger while she stayed safe at range, and he saw in her eyes that she knew exactly what he was thinking and was prepared to refuse it flatly if he tried. He swallowed the instinct. "All right," he said instead. "But Sadie, be careful, please." "You as well," she said, and for just a moment her hand found his, cold and rain-slicked and warm all at once, a brief, fierce pressure before she released it and began moving low along the ridge toward the far side of the canyon. Marshall gave her a count of 200 to get into position, watching the sky darken further, hearing the growing rumble of water somewhere upstream that told him they had perhaps 20 minutes, perhaps less, before the canyon truly began to flood. Then he moved to a position with a clear line on the camp below, checked his rifle, and fired a single shot into the air. "Kane's men!" he shouted, pitching his voice to Carrie, roughened with an accent he did not usually use, hoping the rain and distance would disguise his identity long enough to matter. "This is the law out of Ellsworth. You are surrounded. Lay down your arms." Chaos erupted below, exactly as he had hoped. The guards near the wagon scrambled for cover, rifles coming up, shouting to each other, several of them firing blind shots up toward the ridge where Marshall had already moved 20 feet to a new position, firing again to keep their attention scattered and confused. "There, on the rocks," one of the guards shouted, and Marshall saw with grim satisfaction that all 6 men near the wagons had turned their attention and their weapons toward his position, exactly as planned, while the two guards who had gone into the mine emerged, uncertain, rifles raised, trying to see through the driving rain what was happening. He fired twice more, careful shots aimed to strike rock near the guards rather than the men themselves, sending chips of stone flying and driving them further back toward cover, and prayed silently that Sadie had used the confusion to slip past the two remaining guards near the mine entrance. She had. Marshall caught a glimpse of her, moving low and fast along the base of the far canyon wall, slipping past the distracted guards and into the dark mouth of the mine, just as a genuine wall of water, brown and violent and terrifyingly fast, came surging down the narrow canyon from upstream, sweeping over the lower wagons and sending Kane's men scrambling for the higher ground with panicked shouts. The flood hit with astonishing speed, the kind of flash flood that experienced ranchers spoke of in hushed, respectful tones, water rising visibly by the second, carrying rocks and branches and one entire wagon, wheels spinning uselessly, downstream in a tumble of canvas and splintering wood. Marshall's heart lurched into his throat as he watched the water rise toward the mine entrance where Sadie had disappeared. He was moving before he had consciously decided to, scrambling down the ridge toward the camp, no longer concerned with concealment, only with reaching that mine entrance before the water sealed it entirely. Below, Kane's men, faced with the sudden, overwhelming reality of a flash flood far more immediately dangerous than any imagined lawman on the ridge, were abandoning their positions entirely, scrambling for higher ground, several of them shouting about the mine, about getting the woman and children out before it was too late, their earlier menace forgotten entirely in the face of genuine catastrophe. Marshall reached the mine entrance just as the water was beginning to pour in a muddy sheet across the threshold, and plunged into the darkness within, shouting Sadie's name. "Here!" Her voice came back, echoing strangely off the rock walls from somewhere deeper in the passage. "Marshall here, we need help. The water's coming in fast and there's a beam down blocking part of the tunnel." He found them by touch and sound as much as sight, the darkness nearly complete except for the faint gray light filtering back from the entrance. Sadie was working frantically at a fallen support beam. The woman he'd seen earlier crouched beside her two children, both of them crying, the woman's face a mask of terror and exhaustion. "This beam came down when the water first started rushing in," Sadie said, not looking up from her work, straining against the heavy timber. "It's blocking the low passage back to the entrance, the only way out except this one, and the water's rising faster than I like." Marshall threw his weight against the beam alongside her, and together they managed to shift it enough to clear a narrow gap, water already swirling around their ankles and rising with terrifying speed. "Go," Marshall said to the woman. "Take your children, go now, straight for the entrance, we're right behind you." The woman needed no further urging, scooping up her younger child and pulling the older boy along by the hand, splashing through water that had risen to her knees by the time they reached the gap in the fallen beam. "Who are you?" Marshall asked Sadie as they followed, both of them soaked through, the water now waist-deep and rising, the roar of the flood outside growing louder with every step toward the entrance. "Later," Sadie gasped. "We need to move now, the whole passage sounds like it's shifting." Listen, he heard it then. A deep groaning creak from somewhere above and behind them, old timber supports straining under stress they had not been built to bear in decades, perhaps ever. They half swam, half waded the final stretch toward the entrance, emerging into driving rain and the churning brown chaos of the flooded canyon just as, behind them, a deep rumbling crash announced the collapse of at least part of the tunnel they had just escaped. Kane's men, scattered on higher ground around the canyon rim, stared in shock at the small group emerging from the flooding mine, and made no move to stop them, whether from fear of the storm, confusion about what had just happened, or some flicker of decency Marshall would not have credited them with an hour before. Several of them were already retreating up the far side of the canyon, abandoning the wagons entirely to the rising water, apparently having decided that whatever payment Otis Kane offered was not worth drowning for. They made it to higher ground, all 6 of them, soaked and shaking, and collapsed together in the meager shelter of an overhanging rock ledge, while the flood roared past below, carrying away the last of the supply wagons, the flour and coffee and gunpowder scattering into the current, lost, though Marshall found he could not summon much grief for lost goods when they had all just narrowly escaped drowning. "Now," Marshall said, once they had all caught their breath, turning to the woman who still held her younger child close against her chest. "Who are you, and why in God's name were Kane's men keeping you in that mine?" The woman, when she finally found her voice, was shaking, whether from cold or fear or reaction to their near-death. Marshall could not say, likely all 3. "My name is Ruth Calloway. My husband is Tom Calloway. He drives freight wagons out of Ellsworth. 3 days ago, men came to our homestead saying there had been an accident on his route, that he was hurt and asking for us, and when we went with them, they brought us here instead, told us we'd be kept safe until Tom did what Mr. Kane wanted." Her voice broke. "I didn't understand until just now, hearing you 2 talk, that Tom must be the driver who was paid to divert that supply train. They were holding my children and me to make certain he'd stay quiet about it afterward, or perhaps to make certain he did it in the first place. I don't rightly know which." Sadie's face had gone hard with fury. "Kane took a family hostage to force an honest man into helping him steal an entire town's supplies. It fits everything else he's done," Marshall said grimly. "And it means Tobias's information about a paid-off driver named Cutter was likely only half the truth. There may be 2 drivers, 2 family threats, an entire operation built on exactly this kind of coercion. We need to get the Calloway family somewhere safe," Sadie said. "And then we need to find Tom Calloway, because if Kane thinks he's outlived his usefulness now that the wagons are lost to the flood, he may be in more danger than his family ever was." They spent the remainder of that day working their way carefully back down out of the flooding canyon country, Ruth Calloway and her children mounted on Marshall's horse while he walked alongside leading it, Sadie riding ahead to scout the safest path through country still churning with runoff and unstable footing. By the time full dark fell, they had reached a line shack Sadie knew of, used by Circle D riders during roundup season, dry and stocked with enough supplies for a modest meal and a night's rest for all of them. It was well past midnight, the children finally asleep in the shack's single bed with Ruth curled protectively beside them, when Marshall and Sadie found themselves alone by the small fire in the shack's front room, both of them exhausted past words but too keyed up with the day's events to sleep. "We lost the supply train," Marshall said quietly, staring into the flames. "All of it, gone into the flood. That's the thing we rode out here to save, and it's gone." "We saved 3 lives that would have been lost otherwise," Sadie said. "And we have proof now, better proof than any wagon full of flour could have given us. We have Ruth Calloway, willing to testify to being held hostage by Kane's men. That's not nothing, Marshall. That may be everything. Kane will deny it, say it was some misunderstanding, some rogue employee acting without his knowledge. Then we find Tom Calloway too, and Cutter, and anyone else who can speak to what really happened, and we build a case so complete that no amount of denying will save him." Sadie's eyes met his across the fire, steady despite her obvious exhaustion. "You said it yourself. Back at the Circle D, your word carries weight in Ellsworth precisely because you've spent your whole career refusing to be bought. Use that weight now. We'll find a way." Marshall studied her for a long moment, this woman who had walked into a flooding mine without a second thought to save children who were not her own, who had ridden 2 days through a thunderstorm to protect a valley that was, technically, none of her personal concern beyond her own ranch's borders. "You didn't have to come on this ride, Sadie," he said quietly. "The Circle D isn't threatened by the supply train being stolen, not directly. You could have stayed safe at home and let this be my fight or the sheriff's fight once he's recovered. Could I? Sadie's voice was soft, but there was no doubt in it. Marshall, I have spent 4 years proving to every man in this valley that I don't need protecting, that I can manage my own land and my own troubles without a husband or a father standing between me and the world. But somewhere along the way, I think I forgot that being strong enough to protect myself doesn't mean I stop caring what happens to everyone else. This valley is my home. Those families in Canyon Ford, the ones who will go hungry if Kane succeeds, they're my neighbors. I couldn't have stayed home and called myself the woman I want to be. That, Marshall said, his voice rougher than he intended, is precisely the kind of thing that makes a man start thinking very inconvenient thoughts, Sadie Donnelly. Her breath caught just slightly, and in the firelight he saw color rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the day's exertions. Inconvenient how? Inconvenient in that I came out here to protect this valley's honest commerce and expose a criminal combine. And somewhere along the way, I find myself considerably more concerned with whether the woman across this fire is safe and happy than with any ledger I've ever kept in my life. He held her gaze, his heart hammering harder than it had during the entire flood. Inconvenient because I am a cattle buyer who travels for a living, and you are a rancher rooted to land you fought hard to keep, and there is no obvious way for those two facts to resolve themselves happily, and yet I find I cannot stop thinking about you regardless of how inconvenient that is. Sadie was quiet for a long moment, the fire crackling between them, and when she finally spoke her voice was barely above a whisper. I have been telling myself since Willow Creek that whatever I am feeling is simply the strangeness of the situation, gratitude for a partner in danger, nothing more lasting than that. I am finding it increasingly difficult to believe my own argument. Sadie. Marshall rose and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling beside where she sat, close enough now that he could see every flicker of firelight in her sage-green eyes. I know this is not the time, with everything still unresolved, with a valley depending on us to see this through. But I could not let another day pass without telling you that riding beside you these last 2 days has shown me more of what I want from a life than 11 years of honest ledgers ever did. Marshall. Her hand came up to rest against his jaw, her palm rough with rope callus and rain-chapped skin, and entirely, achingly welcome. I have spent 4 years convincing myself that wanting a partner meant admitting weakness. You have shown me, in 2 days, that it might instead mean something else entirely. He kissed her then gently, tentatively, giving her every chance to pull away, and when she did not, when instead her other hand came up to grip the front of his soaked shirt and pull him closer, he understood with sudden, complete clarity that whatever came next, whatever danger still lay ahead with Otis Kane and his combine, he would face all of it gladly if it meant he got to keep this woman in his life. They broke apart slowly, foreheads resting together, both of them breathing unsteadily. "This changes things," Sadie murmured. "It does," Marshall agreed. "But it does not change what we still have to do. Kane is not finished, and neither are we." "No," Sadie said, straightening, some of her earlier steel returning to her posture even as her hand remained twined with his. "We are not finished, but we will finish it together, Marshall Lockhart, and then we will have a great deal to discuss about what comes after." They rode back toward Canyon Ford the following morning, the storm finally breaking into scattered clouds and watery sunlight. Ruth Calloway and her children safely delivered to the Circle D under Amos Cray's protection, and found the town in a state of nervous agitation, word having spread of Rassler's men searching for a runaway boy and rumors of the missing supply train circulating in increasingly panicked versions. Sheriff Purdy, recovered enough from his fever to sit up and receive visitors, listened with growing fury to Marshall's account of the diverted supply train, the flooded mine, and Ruth Calloway's testimony about her family's coercion. "Otis Kane," Purdy said grimly, once the full account had been laid before him. "I always suspected that man's ambitions ran past honest ranching, but hostage-taking is a hanging offense in any court in this territory, and stealing a supply train meant for an entire town is not far behind it. We'll need more than one witness's word, though, Lockhart. Kane has money enough to buy plenty of testimony contradicting whatever we bring against him. I have shipping manifests going back 2 years that show a pattern of Kane's people underreporting cattle counts and skimming from cooperative accounts, Marshall said. That alone won't hang him, but combined with Ruth Calloway's testimony and Tobias's account of overhearing the original plan, and whatever we can learn from finding Tom Calloway and the other driver, Cutter, I believe we can build a case strong enough to bring before a territorial judge. There's also the matter of Rassler's men shooting Tobias with a crossbow rather than a gun, Sadie added. That speaks to a deliberate choice to keep the attack quiet, to avoid drawing attention with gunfire. That's not the action of men who believe they're in the right. Sheriff Purdy nodded slowly, still pale from his illness but clearly thinking hard. I'll send word to the territorial marshal's office in Ellsworth today, request they send someone with authority to formally investigate, and authority enough to arrest a man like Kane without the whole valley erupting into range war over it. That'll take a few days at best, given the state of the roads after this storm. A few days is time enough for Kane to cover his tracks, or worse, to come after the witnesses we already have, Marshall said. Ruth Calloway and her children, Tobias, potentially the driver Tom Calloway if we can find him. Then we'll need to keep them safe and gathered somewhere secure until the marshal arrives, Sadie said. The Circle D can serve. We've defended it before against lesser threats, and Amos knows how to organize a proper watch. It was decided, over the following hour of tense discussion, that Marshall would ride for Ellsworth himself rather than trusting the message to a rider who might be intercepted, given his personal standing with the Territorial Cattle Exchange, and his ability to speak directly to the marshal's office with the authority of a known and trusted witness. Sadie would remain at the Circle D, coordinating the protection of Ruth Calloway and Tobias, and would continue trying to locate Tom Calloway, who by all accounts had disappeared following the flood, whether fled from Kane's men or fled from guilt over his own role in the scheme. No one could say for certain. 2 days to Ellsworth if the roads have dried enough, Marshall said, checking his gear one final time in the Circle D's yard, the afternoon sun finally breaking clear through the last of the storm clouds. 2 days back, assuming the marshal moves quickly, which is asking a great deal of any government office. 4 days then, perhaps 5. Sadie stood close beside his horse, her arms crossed against a chill that had little to do with the weather. That is a long time for Kane to grow desperate, Marshal. He's already shown he'll take hostages. I don't like the idea of you riding into Ellsworth alone with evidence that could end his entire operation. I don't like the idea of leaving you here either, Marshall admitted. Not with Kane's men still circling, and his desperation likely to grow rather than lessen once he realizes his supply train scheme has failed entirely. But someone has to carry this evidence to Ellsworth, and someone has to hold the line here, and I trust you to hold this line better than any other person I have ever met, Sadie Donnelly. That is either the finest compliment or the most alarming responsibility anyone has ever handed me, Sadie said, though her smile belied any real complaint. Perhaps both. Marshall reached down from his saddle and she stepped close enough for him to take her hand, pressing a kiss against her knuckles that lingered longer than strict propriety might have allowed. 4 days, Sadie. 5 at the outside. I will come back to you, I promise you that, and we will finish what we started, all of it, Kane and everything after. I will hold you to that promise, Marshall Lockhart, Sadie said, her voice steady despite the worry evident in her eyes. Ride safe and ride fast, and do not for one moment think I will not be doing everything in my power to protect this valley while you're gone. I would expect nothing less, Marshall said, and turned his horse toward the Ellsworth road, riding away from the Circle D with his heart considerably heavier than his saddlebags, though both were full to bursting. The 4 days that followed tested Sadie's resolve more thoroughly than she had anticipated. Word of the failed supply train theft had begun circulating through the valley despite everyone's efforts at discretion, and with the word came fear, panic in some quarters, and in others, an ugly undercurrent of blame directed, unfairly but not entirely surprisingly, at the Circle D itself for harboring witnesses against a man as powerful as Otis Kane. On the second day, Rassler himself rode up to the Circle D's gate, alone this time, no longer bothering with the pretense of searching for a runaway boy. Miss Donnelly. He did not dismount, sitting his piebald gelding just outside the fence line with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to being deferred to. Mr. Kane sends his regards, and a warning he'd like delivered plain, seeing as you're clearly a woman who appreciates plain speaking. He knows you're harboring a woman and children that aren't yours to keep, and a boy who took what wasn't his to take. He'd consider it a great kindness if you were to return them, and forget whatever stories they might have told you, and he'd be willing to forget certain outstanding notes on Circle D debt he happens to hold, purchased quietly from your bank some months back, in exchange for your cooperation. Sadie stood on her own porch, Amos and 2 other hands positioned with rifles visible but not raised, and felt her blood run cold at the mention of debt she had not known Kane held any interest in, before her fury overrode her fear entirely. "You tell Otis Kane," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard, "that I have buried better men than him under harder circumstances than a few outstanding notes, and that Ruth Calloway and her children will remain under my protection until a territorial marshal arrives to hear what she has to say about being held hostage by his men in a flooding mine shaft. You may also tell him that Tobias Reyes is recovering well, and has a great deal to say about a conversation he overheard in a barn, and that neither threats nor purchased debt will change one word of it. If Mr. Kane wishes to discuss his notes on my ranch, he may do so through my lawyer, in Ellsworth, in front of a judge, at whatever time is convenient once this business of kidnapping and theft has been properly settled." Rassler's expression darkened, though he said nothing further, wheeling his horse and riding off without another word, and Sadie stood watching him go with her heart hammering and her hands, for the first time in this entire ordeal, trembling slightly with the aftermath of confrontation. "That was well said, Miss Donnelly," Amos said quietly, coming to stand beside her, "though I expect Kane won't take kindly to being refused." "No," Sadie agreed. "I expect he won't. Double the watch tonight, Amos, and send Pete to check on Dr. Hale in town. Make certain Tobias's absence hasn't drawn unwanted attention there." That night, as she had feared, brought trouble. Near midnight, the sound of hoofbeats and shouting roused the entire ranch, and Sadie emerged from the house with her rifle already in hand, to find 3 of Kane's men had attempted to slip past the perimeter watch, apparently intending to seize Ruth Calloway and her children by force under cover of darkness. The confrontation that followed was brief, and mercifully, resulted in no deaths, though it came far closer to bloodshed than Sadie would have liked. Amos and the hands, well-positioned and forewarned, drove off the intruders with warning shots that struck close enough to convince Kane's men that further attempts would carry a genuine cost, and the 3 riders fled back into the darkness, one of them clutching an arm grazed by a bullet that had come, Sadie learned afterward with some private satisfaction, from her own rifle. "They'll be back," Amos said grimly, once the yard had settled and Ruth Calloway had been calmed enough to return her frightened children to bed. "Kane's not the sort to accept one failure and walk away." "No," Sadie agreed, staring out into the darkness where the riders had disappeared, thinking of Marshall somewhere on the road to Ellsworth, hoping desperately that he was safe, that whatever Kane's desperation drove him to attempt next would not extend to intercepting the man carrying evidence against him. "He won't. We need to be ready for whatever he tries next." Marshall reached Ellsworth on the afternoon of the second day, his horse nearly spent, himself little better, and found the territorial marshal's office through a combination of memory and desperate inquiry. Marshal Everett Dunmore, a lean, sun-weathered man in his 50s with the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of enforcing law across difficult country, listened to Marshall's full account with an expression that grew steadily more serious as the details accumulated. "Otis Kane," Dunmore said, once Marshall had finished, laying out his manifests and notes across the marshal's desk. "I've had my suspicions about that man's operations for over a year, Lockhart, but suspicion isn't proof, and I've had no witnesses willing to speak against a man with his resources and reach. Hostage-taking, theft of an entire town's supplies, threatening violence against a woman running her own ranch. This is considerably more serious than the water rights manipulation I'd previously suspected him of. Ruth Calloway is willing to testify. Tobias Ray's as well, once he's fully recovered. And Miss Donnelly witnessed the flooded mine and the hostage-taking directly alongside me." Marshall leaned forward, exhaustion warring with urgency in every line of his body. "But Marshall, I fear for their safety the longer this takes. Kane has already sent men to threaten Miss Donnelly's ranch once. I have no doubt he'll escalate further if he believes his operation is truly at risk of exposure." Dunmore studied the manifest spread across his desk for a long moment, then looked up with the decisive expression of a man who had made his judgment. "I'll ride for Canyon Ford myself, first thing tomorrow, with 2 deputies and proper warrants based on what you've shown me here. It's a hard 2 days' ride, Lockhart, perhaps less if the roads have dried sufficiently, but I won't move faster than caution allows, not against a man with Kane's resources and reach. We'll do this properly, with evidence enough that no court in the territory can dismiss it, and with force enough that Kane cannot simply buy his way past a handful of frightened witnesses." "Thank you, Marshall." Marshall felt something in his chest ease slightly, the first real relief he had allowed himself since leaving the Circle D. "I'll ride back ahead of you, if that's acceptable, to warn Miss Donnelly of your coming, and to help however I can in the meantime." "Get some rest first," Dunmore said, not unkindly. "You look like a man who's been riding through storms and flooded mines for a week straight, which I gather from your account is more or less exactly what's happened. A few hours' sleep won't slow us down, and a rider who falls off his horse from exhaustion helps no one." Marshall took the marshal's advice, sleeping a few hours in a hotel room in Ellsworth before rising well before dawn to begin the ride back toward Canyon Ford, his heart driving him forward faster than good sense probably recommended, every mile bringing him closer to Sadie, and to whatever confrontation still awaited them with Otis Kane. He rode into the outskirts of the valley on the afternoon of what would be the 4th day since he had left, sooner than he had promised but not soon enough to entirely quiet his worry, and found the Circle D's approach unusually quiet, no hands visible in the yard, no smoke from the bunkhouse chimney, an emptiness that set every instinct in him on alert. He found Amos first, in the barn, nursing a bruised jaw and a black eye that told their own story before he spoke a word. "Kane's men came at dawn," Amos said grimly, wincing as he moved. "More of them this time, 8 or 10, not just 3. They took Miss Donnelly and the Calloway family both, and the boy Tobias too. Left the rest of us alive but well beaten, and a message that Miss Donnelly would be released unharmed once you and the marshal called off whatever you're bringing against Mr. Kane." Marshall's blood went cold, then hot with a fury he had rarely felt in his entire measured, careful life. "Where did they take them?" "Same place as before, best I can guess. Deadman's Bend, the old mine claim. It's the only place secure enough and remote enough that Kane trusts to hold hostages without half the valley knowing about it." Amos struggled to his feet, refusing Marshall's offered hand with stubborn pride even as he swayed slightly with the effort. "I'd ride with you, but there's 4 other hands hurt worse than me, and someone needs to stay and see to them and to warn the marshal when he arrives, which by my reckoning should be sometime tomorrow if he made good time from Ellsworth. I'm not waiting for the marshal. Marshall said, already checking his rifle, his revolver, counting his ammunition with hands that shook slightly from fury and fear both. Every hour Kane holds them is an hour too many. Then take Pete with you at least. He's able enough despite his bruises, and you'll want more than one gun against 10 of Kane's men. Marshall considered this only briefly before nodding. All right, but we ride within the hour, Amos. I won't leave her in that man's hands one moment longer than necessary. They rode hard through the afternoon and into evening, Marshall's fury and fear driving them at a pace that left both horses lathered and both men saddle-sore by the time they reached the country above Deadman's Bend under a sky finally, mercifully clear of storm clouds, the moon rising nearly full over canyon walls still scarred with the marks of the recent flood. They approached the old mining camp carefully in the moonlight, and Marshall's heart clenched at what they found. The camp had been rebuilt somewhat since the flood, several new tents erected near the mine entrance, and Sadie, Ruth Calloway, her children, and Tobias were all visible, seated on the ground near a central fire under the watch of no fewer than 8 armed men, with 2 more, Marshall noted grimly, positioned as lookouts on the canyon rim. 10 men, Pete whispered beside him, echoing Amos's earlier count. Same as before, more or less. We can't approach directly, Marshall murmured, studying the camp's layout with the same careful attention he might once have given to a ledger, looking for the pattern, the weakness, the angle that would let 2 men accomplish what should by rights have required a dozen. But look there. The 2 lookouts on the rim aren't well positioned to see the approach from the northeast, where those rocks provide cover almost to the camp's edge. You mean to sneak in? I mean to get close enough to even the numbers before anyone realizes we're here. Marshall checked his rifle one final time, his mind working through the problem with the same methodical care he brought to reconciling a disputed cattle count. Pete, I need you to work your way to that northeast position, get as close as you safely can, and wait for my signal. When you hear me start something, I need you to take out those 2 lookouts, quietly if you can manage it, quickly if you cannot. Can you do that? Pete swallowed hard but nodded. I can. Good. I'm going to try to get close enough to the fire to even the odds directly, create enough confusion that Sadie and the others have a chance to get clear. Marshall's jaw tightened. This is going to be dangerous, Pete. More dangerous than I'd normally ask any man to face alongside me. If you want to ride for the Marshal instead, wait for reinforcements, I would understand. Miss Donnelly's kept my family fed through 2 hard winters when the Circle D didn't have much extra to spare, Pete said quietly. I'm not riding away from paying that back, Mr. Lockhart. Let's do this. They split up, moving through the moonlit rocks with painstaking care, and Marshall felt every minute stretch impossibly long as he worked his way closer to the camp, close enough now to hear voices, to make out individual faces in the firelight, close enough to see Sadie's face, drawn with exhaustion and worry but still defiant, still watching her captors with the sharp, calculating attention of a woman looking for any opportunity to act. He was close enough, finally, to see the moment she noticed him, a flicker of recognition and hope quickly suppressed, her eyes cutting away before any of the guards could follow her gaze and discover his presence. Marshall counted his shots carefully in his mind, positioned himself behind a jumble of boulders that gave him a clear line on 3 of the guards nearest the fire, and waited, watching for any sign that Pete had gotten into position. The signal came sooner than expected, a single sharp cry from the canyon rim, quickly cut short, that told Marshall his hand had found one of the lookouts, followed almost immediately by a scuffle and a second cry as Pete dealt with the other. The guards around the fire reacted instantly, several of them rising with weapons ready, shouting questions up toward the rim that received no answer. This was Marshall's moment, and he took it, firing carefully aimed shots that struck 2 of the nearest guards in the shoulder and leg respectively, disabling rather than killing but creating exactly the chaos and confusion he needed. Sadie down. He shouted, and she reacted instantly, throwing herself and pulling Ruth and the children down flat against the ground as gunfire erupted around the camp, the remaining guards scrambling for cover, uncertain how many attackers they faced, uncertain in which direction real danger lay. Marshall moved through the chaos with a cold, focused determination he had never known himself capable of, firing when he had a clear shot at a threatening weapon, moving constantly to avoid presenting an easy target himself, working his way steadily closer to where Sadie and the others huddled near the fire. He caught sight of Rassler among the guards, directing the defense with the kind of ugly competence that told Marshall this man, at least, would not panic or flee easily. Lockhart. Rassler's voice carried across the chaos, and Marshall saw him take aim not at Marshall himself, but toward the huddled group by the fire, toward Sadie, an act of pure vindictive desperation that made Marshall's blood run to ice. He fired without conscious thought, his shot catching Rassler in the shoulder and spinning him around before his own shot could find its mark. And in the sudden silence that followed, the remaining guards, seeing their leader fallen and clearly outmatched by attackers they still could not properly locate or count, began throwing down their weapons, hands raised, several of them calling out surrender. Marshall moved through the disarmed guards quickly, checking each was truly unarmed before making his way to the fire, where Sadie was already rising, checking on Ruth and the children, her face streaked with dirt and tears of relief as she saw him approaching. Marshall. She met him halfway, and he pulled her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke of every fear he had carried through that desperate ride from the Circle D. You came. Of course I came. He held her tight, feeling her tremble against him, whether from fear or relief or both. I told you I would come back to you, Sadie. I meant every word. They said they'd kill Ruth and the children if I tried anything, Sadie said against his shoulder, her voice unsteady. I couldn't fight back, not with their lives at stake. I had to just wait and hope and pray you'd find a way. I found a way, Marshall said. We found a way, Pete and I, and it's over now, Sadie. It's over. But it was not quite over yet. Even as they spoke, Marshall caught movement from the corner of his eye. Rassler, wounded but not disabled, had struggled to his feet near the mine entrance, a revolver clutched in his uninjured hand, and was raising it with the desperate focus of a man who had nothing left to lose, aiming not at Marshall, who stood with his back partially turned, but at Sadie, still held close in Marshall's arms, completely exposed. Marshall saw it in the half-second before Rassler fired, saw the barrel swinging toward Sadie's unprotected side, and moved on pure instinct, pushing her hard to the ground and away from the line of fire even as he raised his own weapon. He had one round left in his revolver, the rest spent in the chaos of the earlier fighting, and he knew it even as he brought the weapon up, knew this single shot had to count because there would be no second chance if he missed, not with Rassler's gun already leveling for a killing shot at the woman he loved. Marshall fired his last bullet. The shot took Rassler square in the chest, and the man crumpled backward against the mine entrance's timber frame, his own shot going wide into the darkness overhead, and then he slid down to sit against the rock, breathing but clearly finished with fighting, his revolver falling from nerveless fingers into the dirt. The silence that followed felt enormous, broken only by Ruth Calloway's children crying softly, and the distant call of a night bird somewhere up on the canyon rim, oblivious to the violence that had just concluded below. Marshall lowered his empty revolver slowly, his hands beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed, and turned to find Sadie already climbing to her feet, staring at him with an expression he would remember for the rest of his life, equal parts shock and gratitude and something deeper still, something that looked very much like love fully realized in a single desperate moment. You had one bullet left, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You used your very last bullet to save me. I would have used every bullet I ever owned, Sadie Donnelly, and my bare hands after that, and everything I have left in this world to keep you safe. Marshall crossed the distance between them and pulled her close again, his empty revolver still hanging forgotten from his hand. "I told you I was coming back to you. I did not ride through that flood and that ambush and everything else just to lose you in the final moment." Ruth Calloway, gathering her children close, watched this exchange with tears in her own eyes. "You saved us all," she said quietly. "A family that isn't even yours, Mr. Lockhart, and you gave everything you had to protect us regardless." "You matter," Marshall said simply, still holding Sadie close, his heart finally beginning to slow from its frantic pace. "Every family in this valley matters, whether or not they're mine by blood or by choice. That's what Kane never understood, and it's what cost him everything in the end." The remaining guards, disarmed and thoroughly beaten in every sense, offered no further resistance. Several of them, once questioned, proving remarkably willing to testify against Kane in exchange for leniency regarding their own involvement, having clearly reconsidered their loyalty to a man whose schemes had led to flash floods, hostage-taking, and now a shootout that had cost their leader his freedom if not his life. Marshal Dunmore and his deputies arrived the following morning, having ridden through the night once word reached them via a rider Amos had sent ahead, and found the situation largely resolved, the hostages freed, the guilty parties disarmed and awaiting justice, and Otis Kane's carefully constructed criminal enterprise laid bare for anyone with eyes to see. Kane himself was arrested 3 days later at his ranch house, having apparently believed, until the moment federal deputies arrived at his door, that his money and influence would insulate him from consequences indefinitely. The trial that followed, held in Ellsworth before a territorial judge, was swift and thorough, built on the combined testimony of Ruth Calloway, Tobias Ray's, Marshall's careful manifests, and the surprising cooperation of several of Kane's own former guards, and concluded with a sentence of 15 years in the territorial prison for kidnapping, theft, and conspiracy. A sentence that satisfied most of Canyon Ford's residents as appropriately severe, without descending into the kind of vigilante justice that might have torn the valley apart entirely. Tom Calloway, Ruth's husband, was located a week later, having been hiding in genuine terror in Ellsworth, afraid both of Kane's retribution and of prosecution for his own role in diverting the supply train. His testimony, given willingly once he understood his family was safe, and that his coercion under threat would be treated as mitigating circumstance rather than equal guilt, provided the final piece needed to fully close the case against Kane and several of his closest associates. By the time the last of the legal proceedings concluded, nearly 3 weeks had passed since Marshall's last bullet had ended Rassler's threat to Sadie's life, and in that time, something had grown steady and certain between them, tested by danger and confirmed by every quiet moment they had managed to steal amid the chaos of testimony and investigation. They stood together on the Circle D's porch on a clear August evening, the summer storms finally beginning to give way to the calmer weather of late season, watching the sun set gold and orange over land that Sadie had fought so hard to keep, land that Marshall found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, deeply reluctant to ever leave again. "The Territorial Cattle Exchange has offered me a position in Ellsworth," Marshall said quietly, watching the light fade across the canyon rim. "A permanent post, overseeing manifest audits across the whole territory. It's steady work, respected work, considerably safer than riding the circuit buying cattle from ranch to ranch." Sadie was quiet for a moment, and Marshall could see her working through the implication, the distance between Ellsworth and the Circle D, the choice such a position might force between them. "That is a fine opportunity," she said carefully. "It would mean you'd be settled, rather than traveling constantly. It would mean I'd be 2 days' ride from you, rather than wherever the cattle trade happened to take me," Marshall said. "Which is either a great improvement or an insurmountable problem, depending on what you think of the idea of a cattle auditor courting a rancher from a considerable distance." "I think," Sadie said slowly, turning to face him fully, that I have spent 4 years building something on this land that I am not willing to leave, not even for a man I have come to love as completely and as quickly as I have come to love you, Marshall Lockhart. The Circle D is not just property to me. It is my father's memory, my own hard work, my place in this valley and this community. I cannot ask you to give up a fine position in Ellsworth, but I also cannot promise to follow you there. I would never ask you to, Marshall said immediately, taking her hands in his. Sadie, I did not fall in love with you despite your fierce attachment to this land. I fell in love with you partly because of it, because you are a woman who knows exactly what she wants and fights to keep it, and I would be a poor sort of man indeed to love that quality in you, and then ask you to abandon it for my convenience. Then, what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Marshall said, that the territorial cattle exchange needs its manifests audited across this entire region, not merely in Ellsworth itself, and that a man in such a position might reasonably argue for establishing his base of operations wherever proved most practical for covering the ranches he's meant to oversee. Canyon Ford sits at the heart of some of the finest cattle country in the territory, Sadie. There is no reason at all that my work could not be based here, with occasional travel to Ellsworth for the exchange's formal business, rather than the reverse. Sadie's eyes widened slightly, hope kindling visibly in her expression. You would give up Ellsworth, the position, the steady, prestigious work to base yourself here instead. I would give up considerably more than that, if it meant building a life alongside you, Marshall said. I have spent 11 years alone, Sadie, moving from town to town, ranch to ranch, keeping honest ledgers that cost me friendships and nearly cost me my life, and I told myself it was worth it because I slept well at night. But these past weeks with you, riding through storms, facing down Kane's men, watching you fight for this valley and these people with everything you have, I have come to understand that sleeping well is not the same as truly living. I want to truly live, Sadie, and I want to do it here with you if you'll have me. Sadie was quiet for a long moment, tears standing bright in her eyes in the fading evening light before she spoke, her voice thick with emotion but absolutely certain. I have spent 4 years telling myself and everyone else in this valley that I did not need a husband to be complete, that the Circle D was enough, that my own strength and stubbornness were sufficient for whatever life required of me. I still believe that, Marshall. I do not need a husband to survive or to run this ranch or to be a whole and capable woman in my own right. I know, Marshall said softly, I would never want you to need me that way. But I find, Sadie continued, her voice growing steadier even as tears finally spilled over, that not needing you is entirely different from not wanting you. And I want you, Marshall Lockhart, more completely and more certainly than I have ever wanted anything beyond the survival of this ranch itself. I want to build a life with you here, at the Circle D, or wherever else our lives might lead us, as partners, as equals, as two people who choose each other freely rather than out of necessity. Then choose me, Marshall said, sinking to one knee on the porch boards, producing from his coat pocket a simple gold band he had purchased in Ellsworth during the trial proceedings, carried with him every day since in anxious hope. Sadie Donnelly, choose me the way I choose you, freely, completely, for exactly as long as we both shall live. Marry me, not because you need protecting, because I have seen with my own eyes that you need no such thing, but because I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world, and I want the privilege of standing beside you for the rest of our days. Sadie laughed through her tears, a sound of pure joy that carried across the quiet evening yard, and sank down to kneel with him on the porch, taking his face in both her hands. Yes, she said. Yes, Marshall Lockhart, I will marry you, and gladly, and I promise you that our life together will be exactly as full of partnership and equal choice as you have just described, because that is the only kind of marriage I am interested in having. He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and kissed her there on the porch in the gathering dusk, the Circle D spread out around them, hard-won and beautiful in the fading light, and felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he had finally arrived somewhere worth staying. They married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony in Canyon Ford attended by the whole Grateful Valley, Ruth Calloway and her family among the honored guests, Tobias Reyes, fully recovered, and now employed as a hand at the Circle D at Sadie's insistence, standing proudly near the front, and Amos Cray giving Sadie away with the gruff, tearful pride of a man who had watched her grow from a girl into the formidable woman she had become. Marshall took up his position with the Territorial Cattle Exchange as he had proposed, based out of Canyon Ford with regular travel to audit manifests across the surrounding ranches. His honest reputation, if anything, enhanced rather than diminished by his role in exposing Otis Kane's criminal combine. Sadie continued to run the Circle D with the same fierce competence she always had, though now with a partner beside her who understood implicitly that her strength was not something to be managed, but something to be celebrated, treasured, and matched with his own. The bridge and the ferry at Canyon Ford, freed from the threat of combine control, continued to serve the valley as they always had, the town's trade and its people's independence secured for a generation to come, thanks in no small part to two people who had ridden into danger together as strangers and emerged, weeks later, as partners in every sense that mattered. On quiet evenings, sitting together on the porch of the home they were building together, watching summer storms roll in over the canyon rim, lightning flickering distant and harmless now against a sky that had once carried such danger and desperation, Marshall would sometimes think back to that first terrible moment, Tobias falling wounded into the dusty street, the desperate ride through flooding country, the last bullet fired to save the woman who had become his whole world. He would think of how close they had come to losing everything, and how instead they had found, in the midst of that danger, something far more precious than either of them had known they were searching for. "Any regrets?" Sadie asked him once, months into their marriage, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched a distant storm light up the evening sky. "Only one," Marshall said, pressing a kiss to her hair, "that I didn't ride into Canyon Ford a year sooner and get to spend that much more time loving you." Sadie laughed softly, tilting her face up to his. "I suppose we'll simply have to make up for lost time then, Marshall Lockhart." "I suppose we will," Marshall agreed and kissed her properly, there on the porch of their shared home, with the storm rolling closer and neither of them minding in the least, because they had learned in the crucible of danger and desperate courage that the truest shelter either of them had ever found was simply each other, and that was a truth no storm, however fierce, could ever wash away.